So, good morning, everyone. You can just sit and we will start. For those who don't know me, I'm Laura Kelly. I'm Politico's new tech reporter, and I cover platforms, copyright, media, consumers, and other and fake news, illegal content. So we're here today to talk about consumer policies in the digital age. And 2018 has been rich in consumer news. GDPR entered into force. We saw the first complaints. The Commission presented the New Deal for consumers with the omnibus proposal and collective redress. So we will talk about all of this today. Also, we're 6 months from the end of the mandate, so now is a good time to assess what has been done, what is left until the end of the mandate, and what are the priorities for the next Commission. I want to thank our partner, the European Gaming and Betting Association, for making this possible. Thank you to MEPs Dita Charantsova and Miriam Dali for hosting us today. And thank you for coming so early. And thank you to our online audience, and welcome to the European Parliament. After the sessions, after the discussion, there will be some Q&A session, so I encourage you to ask as many questions as you want. And to tweet with the hashtag digital consumers. And after, to please fill your evaluation form so that we can make the next event even better. And before starting the discussion, I would like to introduce Jesper Karberg, the CEO of Mr. Green.
Members of Parliament, dear Commissioner Jourova, colleagues and friends. Thank you for having us here today to discuss the important theme, making the digital economy working for consumers. And it's our pleasure to host this debate as part of EGBA's annual Responsible Gaming Day. We are experiencing a digital revolution. The online world offers us all enormous new opportunities, great access to information, and new products and services. But digitalization also creates new challenges and responsibilities, not least for these companies offering their services in the online environment. Ensuring that consumers benefit from digitalization in a safe and secure way is a big challenge and today's topic for the debate. And as you can imagine, for us, the online gaming companies, we have an extra responsibility for our players and consumers, especially for that percent of the population that ends up as problem gamblers. Making these consumer protection responsibilities requires corporate leadership as well as regulations which reflects the online world that we are living in. On your desk, you will find this, the EGBA's EU framework, where we are setting out exactly what we want the incoming Parliament and the Commission to look at when it comes to the digital environment. And we are actually one of the few sectors, the online gaming industry, who ask for more European Union regulations, not less. Because online gamblers should have the same customer protection as, and if not more, than consumers buying a book or a flight ticket online. And this is not the case today. Because online gambling in Europe is regulated locally. That means that the level of consumer protection is based on where you reside within the European Union, which is entirely inadequate for what is an inherently borderless digital economy. For instance, only about half, and I repeat, half of the EU member states has a self-exclusion register for players who wants to exclude themselves from accessing gambling sites. And this is the basic safety network. Likewise, there's only some of the member states that requires age notifications on advertising gambling. Furthermore, in Europe's gambling sector, there is no formal regulatory coordination between the national authorities. This means no exchange of information, no joint action against rogue online behavior or match fixing, cross-border fraud, tackling websites outside the European market, or even a bridge for big gaps in consumer protection. More needs to be done. Today, we, the online gaming company, are already following and analyzing the risk behavior of our players. We do that every second, every spin is registered, and we interfere in a completely different way than we could do a couple of years ago, all thanks to data. This has also helped our sector advance the use of artificial intelligence and the range of other digital tools that we will talk more about later today to help tackle problem gambling. We are, in some areas, in the front round of using AI and other tools to make sure that our player keeps in control. For digital companies like my own, the challenge of borderless digitalization is to grasp the great opportunities that modern technology provides, and at the same time, use this to build in player protection into the products we offer to our customers. But new solutions also create new challenges. We must build, test, analyze, and constantly change. And digital-savvy EU consumer protection rules could help us in this work. But we need EU policymakers to act. On that note, I'm very much looking forward to today's conversation, and thank you, and I hope you will have an enjoyable event today. Thank you.
So before we start the conversation, let me introduce our panel. So we have Vera Jourova, European Commissioner for Justice, Consumers and Gender Equality, Dita Charantsova, MEP from the ALDE Group, Christian Borgrin, Vice President and Head of Office of the Computer and Communications Industry Association, and Ursula Pachel, Deputy Director General of BEUC, the European Consumers Association. So my first question is for you, Commissioner. We're here to talk about consumer policy in the digital age. So my first question is, what has been done during this mandate and what is left to be achieved before 2019?
Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to start apologizing that sharply 9:45 I have to run away. So if you...
We will free you in time.
If you want to shout to me, please, more regulation needed, do it now. Because it is what I already heard from the first speaker, and it's not very often to hear this, because usually when I go to the member states, I hear less regulation, and my response always is, and it's also for today, more or less, we have to do smart regulation. Smart to the extent which is necessary and proportionate. I am liberal, as my colleague Dita, so you cannot expect from me that I would like to overregulate this world. However, digital revolution, new technologies, new challenges, of course we all know that it requires reaction from the side of the regulators and enforcers of the law. It must not be a jungle, because we see that more and more people use online shopping as the only way they buy things, and it also, of course, applies to the sphere of gambling and gaming. Our position on your question is, let's apply the law which exists now on, yes, maybe new situation, but a lot of our current rules are applicable. And where necessary, let's react and let's come with the new regulation, which we have done in the so-called New Deal for consumers, where there is a lot of new things which should eliminate or minimize this online jungle. Sorry, I am maybe using too over-exaggerated term, but sometimes I had that feeling that also many people think that online sphere is such a fantastic democratic sphere where no rules are needed. No, this is the basic position of the Commission. Yes, rules are needed. If you let me explain our philosophy. We face a big expansion of mainly American IT companies. Many of them thought at the beginning that they will import Californian law into European system. And we said no. Here are European consumers who require high standards and equal treatment and high-level treatment. And so this is also a pedagogical work we have to do when speaking to IT companies about the need to reflect the current EU consumer law in their contracts, for instance. I don't want to go into details, but if you like, I can tell you what we are doing on this. We want them to understand who is European consumer, that it's the person who has to be well-informed to take a well-informed, responsible choice. It is not a lawyer. He or she is not a lawyer who is able to read complicated contracts. I am a lawyer and I don't understand those contracts neither, yeah, when I sometimes read them. So we are pushing on simplicity. The European consumer is somebody who must know who he buys from. So there must be information about who is my contractual partner. He must know if they pay, he or she must know when he or she pays with the private data, because this is the new money. At the same time, we say protection of privacy is fundamental right. You see the difficulty here. They must know what and at what moment they contract. They do this click, I agree, sometimes before knowing all the conditions. So I don't want to go into details, but the well-informed choice, more transparency, more information in a simple way, fair game, I would say, must be played online with the European consumer. So this is our philosophy. When I say we need to have well-informed consumers, we also need to have responsible consumers for their own behavior. We need to explain to people what are the risks, what they should be careful about. So this is not one-way communication and one-side problem. The third player, so it's IT, it's the consumer, the third player are the enforcers. We have given much stronger competencies to national authorities enforcing the law. Maybe you know the new regulation, the consumer cooperation regulation, which enables to act in cases of mass harm or harm which has cross-border scope, which is absolutely important because we have single market and we want to build digital single market. So we need to act across borders. So all that philosophy about a well-informed, responsible consumer, the protection which must be guaranteed by the IT sector, and strong enforcers. This is in the New Deal for consumers. I don't know how familiar you are with this big package of new rules. What we tried to do to modernize the rules, to reflect the new threats and risks coming from digital, to get rid of old stuff, because some of the directives reflected the situation from the 80s of the last century. So it's prehistorical time from the point of view of the technology development. We are introducing all those transparency criteria. We are introducing the need to inform the people about the ranking of the offers and so on. We are updating the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive, where there is also the article which can be used for gambling and gaming industry. And we are introducing historical first European collective redress possibility for the people to join forces and to go together to either to alternative dispute settlement or to the court. Last comment on what the Commission does and wants to do. You can either regulate through the sector or you take the general policy. When you look at, for instance, an energy sector or telecommunications, this is the sector policy, the sector regulation, and the consumers' interests are put into this sector legislation. And this is what I am convinced should happen also in the future regulation related to gaming and gambling. It might be the big task for the new Commission to come with the regulation, and the consumer's interest should be embedded into this regulation. This Commission can prepare and should prepare everything based on the recommendation we gave the member states in 2014, and maybe, as I said, it will be reflected by the new Commission, but there must be three things in place. Big pan-European problem, which obviously is here. Strong legal competence of the EU. It's a bit weaker here because up to now it was taken mainly as a health problem. And if we say that the priority is that it is the single market problem, then the EU should have the competence. And the third, strong demand from the member states who say we are not able to solve the problem on our own. You have heard about the principle of subsidiarity. So this is the test which we will have to use, and I am happy to cooperate on preparing everything for the future smart regulation if it will be proven as needed at the European level. Thank you, and sorry to be so long.
Just have one quick question before we ask Dita for her perspective. You were talking about Californian companies that have to adapt their contracts to European legislation. The Commission has asked Facebook to adapt their contracts. Airbnb already has, as you announced before the summer, but what's the state of play concerning Facebook?
We didn't announce that Airbnb did it, but that they are on a good track. We are going to check now in December how they changed their contractual rules to be compliant and fit with the EU high standards and with the EU legislation. Also, Facebook, I remember from September, was investing efforts into changing their contractual rules, but we have to check it now. That's our task by the end of the year. Look at it. It is a good illustration of how they think, what do you think we will swallow in Europe? We will not swallow the things which they are importing here. For instance, to contract before, to make a contract from the consumer side before we know all the information about the price. Forget it. We need to know the final price. To give up the rights to apply to complain about the damages and ask for the compensation. It was in the contract. The consumers signed that they give up their future rights. Forget it. in the EU. We have this guaranteed by the law, and I could continue. So we needed to put this in order. And yes, it is self-regulatory to some extent, but it's very hard from our side that we insist on reflecting the laws of the EU, guaranteeing the high standards of the consumers in the contracts. It's a must.
Dita, the Commissioner was mentioning the New Deal for consumers, which has not been adopted yet in the Parliament, neither proposals. Why? What is blocking?
Thank you very much, Laura, and
Thank you for this question.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the European Parliament. It's nice to see the crowds here in the morning. I would perhaps start with your general questions because it's linked to your second questions. So I think we have managed, thanks to the proposals of the Commission, to deliver quite a lot. I would perhaps mention geo-blocking, which started yesterday, which I think it's a excellent example that there won't be any discrimination online. Some of you know that I was critical to the final outcome, and it's exactly where sometimes we have problems, that the idea at the beginning is good, but at the end we end up with a compromise of compromises. I'm afraid that we might see the same with platforms discussion. As you know, we will have an important vote on Thursday on this issue. And there again, I think there was a good intention from the Commission side to come up with a first step how to look at what we can do in the platforms when it comes to business-to-business relationship. But then the discussion started both in the Parliament and on the side of the Council. And here in the Parliament, I think some people want just to use it to over-regulate what I think is the place which should have more self-regulation and only small touches of regulation. So maybe at the end of the day, there won't be any regulation adopted, and it would be the voice of the Liberals, I hope, on the discussion on Thursday. When it comes to consumers, the deal for consumers, I very much welcome the proposal of the Commission because, as it was already said, I think a lot has changed for the consumers. It's not just the offline world, it's the online world where you have different principles. I mean, I'm the one always advocating that the online world is driven by the consumers, that it's very good that we have all the reviews, that it's very good that we have we created the sharing economy, but at the end of the day, when you see the statistics and the concerns of the citizens, of the consumers, you see that there is a task for us, for the legislators. Why? Because people just want to know at least what my rights are, what I will do if something goes wrong, what is the guarantee, what is there the right to return, etc., etc. So if something is really needed as a standard for the consumers, in my view, is the standard for return, that there is a right to return, and also standard for guarantees. I think everybody here would understand if I say 2 years guarantee in Europe, and for me this benefit more or it outweighs the benefits than if I know, for instance, that I can return my toaster after 10 years because in some member states it would be allowed. So I would be the voice to have one single rule on common guarantees in the European Union. On the New Deal for consumers, I come from the Czech Republic, where we've had several problems, what we call now dual quality of products. Something which really is a problem in the internal market. It's not just the problem of some countries, it's overall problem because we have created different classes of consumers. Consumers that have better and sometimes cheaper products, and consumers that have worse products and sometimes more expensive products. So I'm happy that it was this Commission that took on board this issue, and there is exactly where you can see that the Parliament would like to see perhaps tougher line on the consumers' deal. all in all, just to conclude, I think the new deal for consumers is the one where I hope we will be able to deliver. There won't be any, I would say, leftovers for the next parliament. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I turn to Christian and Ursula, since the Commissioner has to leave in 5 minutes, are there any questions in the audience for the Commissioner? No? Okay. So Christian, this event is entitled Making the Digital Economy Work for Consumers. So my question for you is, since you represent the digital economy, does it work for consumers?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the very kind invitation to speak today. Well, you will not be surprised to hear that I would argue that the digital economy largely already works for the consumer. We talk about this creating an EU single market, but the reality is for users that the single market is already a jungle, very often a jungle of national different rules, and of course of natural barriers like languages. I wouldn't know how to buy from a Maltese shop. I don't speak Maltese. But thanks to platforms, that is helping consumers and sellers to easily overcome all these natural barriers. And it helps create a single market for consumers. I would argue that online, the customer is king, even more king online than offline. If you live in a village and you only have one shop, well, then you have very little choice to pick from. But online, you can easily compare prices, find information, etc. It's not perfect, but it's better. It's a better experience as compared to offline. And of course, online platforms are only as popular as long as their business users and end consumers are happy, because competition is just one click away. I want to also touch on prices. In Belgium, and many of you probably know this, when you buy your daily products, these are more expensive than in neighboring countries. The president of the Belgian Competition Authority recently explained that consumer prices in Belgium are more than 10% more expensive than in neighboring Germany, than in Netherlands. Some of it is for natural reasons. He believes that e-commerce can provide more competition to the market and lower consumer prices. I think that's a great win for consumers. So clearly, the digital economy is already benefiting consumer, and good EU policy can further improve this. I'm very happy to go into more details on the different proposals that we discussed early on, but maybe I'll just stop here since the Commission has to leave very soon.
And Ursula, do you agree? I saw you were not really agreeing when Christian said that competition is just one click away. So what's your take on the digital economy and consumer protection?
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Well, I'm not totally convinced of what my neighbor just said. Maybe just to give you the big picture and also looking a bit at what we have on the table, what we have achieved. I would say that we have already a lot that has been adopted by the current European legislator, and the Commission has proposed some very interesting things that will certainly give concrete benefits to consumers. Mrs. Karantsova mentioned the portability of content. Of course, we have witnessed the end of roaming. We have a European electronic communication code that has many elements that will give stronger rights to consumers. We have in there now also, and also thank you to Mrs. Karantsova, the inter-community calls which will become cheaper, which have not been covered by the roaming regulation. We have the geo-blocking regulation that entered into application only yesterday, so there has been a lot. But may I say most of that has been trying to give consumers access to the single market, and I think that's very important. We have made a big step. But on the other hand, the challenges are ever bigger today than there were maybe 5 years ago. And why is that? Because we have, I think, a monopolistic platform economy for the time being in Europe. Consumers don't have choices as they should have. And if I say what we have achieved, what this Commission have achieved, I think I would like to mention the competition law enforcement that this Commission has been a front runner internationally on, which we very much welcome. I also would like to mention the GDPR, the Data Protection Regulation, which is also an international front runner and which we have to see now how it will apply in practice, how it will be enforced by the data protection authorities, that will be absolutely crucial. So we have already a good picture, but the challenges, I did not yet mention artificial intelligence, algorithm, how that will lead and already leads to a market that is a black box market where consumers don't understand anymore how the offers that they see have been generated, why they see certain offers and not others, what is the basis for the search results that they are being presented with, what is the basis for certain rankings that they see. And so we have with the consumer deal a very important first step to have much more transparency in online marketplaces. But the step is also, if I may say, a limited step because it's only for online marketplaces. It does not yet go as far as to look at how can we make algorithms more transparent, how can we explain to consumers what is the data that have been used, what is the logic of the result that is presented to the consumer. So there is a big, big challenge ahead. I can go further to talk about the future challenges, but this was just a resume, maybe to say the New Deal for us, a very welcome initiative. You know that it has two parts. One is on enforcement and one is on digitalization. On enforcement, I would like to mention that this is currently still the Achilles scene of European consumer law. We have good material laws and rights, but they are not enforced. So we have now a proposal for stronger sanctions for the authorities, for remedies for consumers, and that is very important, and collective redress. So this is really three elements that are absolutely necessary, and we have proposals for more transparency for platforms, and obviously that is very necessary because currently consumers, they do not benefit from the choice that is not one click away, and they don't understand well enough how the platform economy functions. Thank you.
You have to. Okay. Thank you. So, Ursula, you're part of the high-level group on AI. Is consumer policy something that is discussed in this group?
That's a very good question. Thank you very much. So I don't know if you know the mandate of the high-level group. The mandate is to come up with two deliverables. One is guidance on ethics for artificial intelligence, and the other one is policy recommendations for policy that is relevant for artificial intelligence. And so from a consumer perspective, from a consumer lawyer perspective that I am, the question is, why do we talk about ethics when we have consumer rights that have been well established in the European Union? We have consumer rights that are linked to information, to transparency, to safety. So all of this has been already established. So why do we now start to talk about ethics when ethics are voluntary principles that companies probably can adhere to? They are non-democratic because they have just been established. In this case, it will be by a group of experts that have been chosen by the European Commission. As far as I understand, the Commission will not endorse these principles of ethics. So why is that? So this is, from our point of view, a discussion that does not go in the right direction. You may have a lot of ethical questions when it comes to artificial intelligence, the use of data, the collection of the data, which is, of course, regulated by the GDPR, but you may have further going question in the health sector, for example, patients questions. But for the classical consumer rights, for the functioning of the market, which will be heavily impacted by artificial intelligence-powered algorithms, we don't really want to talk about ethics because we want to talk about consumer rights. And we want to talk about whether the current consumer law acquis is fit for purpose when we confront it with a market that will be run by algorithms and automated decision-making, and what are the rights of consumers in this situation, and can consumers still deal with the information, because the information will maybe not tell enough in a very complicated and even more complex market than it is already today. So these are the questions which we think should be discussed. We are not so happy about the ethics. And then the composition of this high-level group is, of course, not, in our opinion, adequate in relation to the mandate that it has, namely to look at the communication of the European Commission on artificial intelligence, which is covering everything, not only the market and economy and growth and investment, but also societal impact of artificial intelligence. And that will be a big, big impact, good things, but also challenges and a lot of risks there, and we think that has not been sufficiently covered by the mandate. I'm the only consumer representative in that group. Thank you.
Maybe just a quick comment on AI, and I actually agree with Ursula. There's a lot of questions and a lot of challenges. I think we should be honest about that. However, from an industry point of view, when we have an AI discussion in Europe, it's a little bit like a sort of spectator sport, almost like tennis, where you sort of look either to the far east or to the far west, because that is actually where AI is happening at the moment. That's where we see the massive investments and strategies for AI. Very little is happening here in Europe. I think we should steer how AI is being developed, but Europe's best chance of steering that is if AI is actually being developed and being allowed to be developed in Europe. And that requires, of course, strategies, including a national level. I think Chancellor Merkel will make a speech today, I think, and AI will be prominently featured in her speech. We need to have investment, need to have talent that can develop AI in Europe. And I think maybe the principles on ethics based on European values can be part of steering that. The problem often with sort of fast technology is that regulation takes a very long time. Often EU regulation takes like 5 years, half a decade, to do it properly. And I don't think that will change. You can do things where consumers, decision makers, companies and academics, where they meet and they come up with sort of co-regulation or self-regulation. And that is a way to do things much quicker. It's not always appropriate. Sometimes that is the first step when you have some fast-changing technologies to allow that to develop by trying to do that together. And if there later is evidence, solid evidence of problems that has to be regulated, well, then hard regulation can be the answer. Thank you.
Dita, from a legislator point of view.
Well, on artificial intelligence, I think this is the topic for the next Commission and the European Parliament. I would very much agree with what has been said, that artificial intelligence is a key in transforming of our society, and there the EU for the moment is really lagging behind. I think the response to it is, I think, perhaps also to change our mindset. I don't see artificial intelligence as a separate topic somewhere. I think we have to bear it in mind whatever we do in the legislation. So I would perhaps call on having some overall, once you have, for instance, impact assessment, that the artificial intelligence angle is always in. So that we look at any new legislation from the perspective of whether we develop artificial intelligence or we create some barriers to develop it. Second point would be that we have to, I think, reassess the current legislation we have, whether it fits the artificial intelligence developments or not. One of a good example which is already happening is the directive on liability. But there will be more to come. So I would say, let's change the mindset. Artificial intelligence is an integral part of, I would say, every piece of legislation.
Okay. So now we will open the floor for questions. So are there any questions? Yes. Please state your name and organization.
Absolutely. Hi, I'm Nicolas Moes. Good morning. I'm from the Future Society. We are a non-profit that deals with the good governance of artificial intelligence. Dita Karantsova, you just mentioned that AI would be the topic for the next Commission and the next Parliament. I was wondering whether, like, the current dossiers at the own initiative on industrial policy for AI robotics, you do hope that this will be passed like before that or after for the next Commission, actually, because a lot of these issues that you are talking about are addressed in that dossier. Thank you.
Yes, a lot of these issues are addressed there. Parliament will also adopt our position on artificial intelligence in the coming weeks. I'm the one dealing with the opinion of the IMCO committee. But I would just say we are preparing the grounds. I mean, the key decision, or I would like to see as, for instance, the digital single market was the main priority of the current Commission. I would like to see the next president of the Commission saying, artificial intelligence, this is the future of Europe.
Are there any other questions? Yes, please.
Thank you. This is Francesco Di Lodovico from Ambrosetti, the Italian think tank. I have two questions for the panel. The first one, it's about, we are talking about consumers' protection. Maybe a missing spot in this theme is about how consumers are reached out from and from whom whenever it comes to operators based and located in offshore geographies. And thanks to the technology, they are today very much easy in reaching out to consumers in Europe. So is there any piece of your thinking or draft legislation which is addressing this competitive issue, which reach out to consumers as well? The second question is about addiction. So gaming has been historically linked with an issue of addiction for players, users. And of course, digital technology has a cumulative impact on this addiction, so it may kind of become even more compelling, an additive effect in using gaming technology. Is this kind of dimension of the problem, as far as consumers are concerned, taken into consideration in your thinking? Thanks.
Who were your questions for?
That's for the panel. Yeah.
Okay, so, yeah, sure.
I think you mean with offshore, you mean third countries, right? So countries, not member states of the European Union. Certainly what we have experienced, and which is very important also for the future, is electronic commerce from third countries. So where consumers themselves reach out to China, for example, to buy there. And that has increased significantly in the past 2-3 years to a degree which is, I think, really to a point that it really is an issue for European consumer policy. And now the question is, of course, what do consumers do in these circumstances when something goes wrong? So if they received a defective product or if they want to send back the product. And normally, according to European legislation, international private law, you would say if the consumer has not really by him or herself really gone to the website in Chinese language with another currency, it's the consumer, him or herself, who has to face the foreign law, and that is often very much less protective than the European legislation. But often you have these websites that still are in a language that is comprehensible, for example in English, that you have currencies indicated that are, for example, in euros. So that means targeting the European market, that means applicability of European consumer law. Perfect. But how do you enforce that? Because even if you have European law that protects you theoretically, you don't have enforcement. Even though you have jurisdiction in the European Union, in your home country potentially, how do you go about that if you have a judgment that says, okay, this company there is found to be guilty, and how do you enforce that? That's a different chapter. So what we think has really to be improved is enforcement cooperation. We didn't talk about enforcement so much, but enforcement is fundamentally important for the future. It's a bit of a weird thing because the European Commission doesn't have competence except in competition law, but the working together of enforcement networks in, for example, consumer law, there is an international network for consumer authorities, that is absolutely crucial. So we see that as an important element. Addiction, I think that's a big topic. Of course, we have certain protections for children, but these are all related to unfair commercial practices. You could, I think, maybe qualify certain practices as aggressive practices when you're constantly pushed to buy something, to do something, to give your data away. But there, I think we're really only at the beginning. And I just want to highlight also that with the digital technology, there is a lot of use of what I would call aggressive pushing consumers to making certain choices, which is often referred to as nudging. I don't think that's positive nudging. It's a very negative nudging. We've seen that. I don't know if you know, our members have done studies about how you're nudged into giving your data away, into choosing on your phone, for example, the settings that are not the privacy-friendly settings, but privacy-unfriendly settings, how you're given an illusion of control of your data when you do the contrary, but you don't understand really what you're doing because it's hidden, it's misleading. So that's the type of thing that also leads to addiction, and we think we need to be much more aware of these things and much more target and enforce consumer rights in that respect. Thank you.
Very briefly, because I think you touched upon the point that we hear very often from the consumers. The response is not an easy one. I think what we have started as legislators doing is, one, market surveillance. Second, that there is more exchange of information between the customs authorities. And third, which is the biggest challenge, empowering the consumers. So the consumers must also take a little bit of responsibility to know, if I go to this website, does this website have all the necessary and information that makes me more confident to buy from this website? So these are, I think, the three main elements where we have to look. First of all, the market surveillance. Second, that we avoid all really dangerous products on the EU market. Second, more information sharing, exchange of information. And third, empowering the consumers.
Thank you. Are there other questions? Yeah, sure.
Just on the transparency point in the EU consumer package, so companies and platforms already provide some amount of transparency, and we can agree whether that is enough or not. For platforms, it's very important that their business users understand how to be able to sell and how they're happy on their users, so they don't go to other platforms. We want business users to be successful on the platforms. So we need to get this balance right. It doesn't mean that more transparency is always better. More transparency on ranking parameters, for instance. Full transparency would risk revealing trade secrets. This is part of the competitive advantage of platforms, how they compete against each other. And it could also allow for bad actors to sort of game platforms' algorithms. So too much transparency could actually end up harming consumers. And think about it, there's no such transparency requirements in the offline world. When you go into the supermarket, I don't understand why the chocolate is this level or this level. I always have to bend down. I don't know why. So supermarkets are not required to explain how they display products. So yes to transparency, but we just need to get the balance right.
Yes, sure.
Yeah, I have to respond to that. Of course, transparency is not the answer, and I think this is exactly a very relevant point, because we need much more than transparency. We need protection by default and by design, because transparency has been a concept since 30 years, the main regulatory tool in consumer policy. And we have always seen its limits. It has always been the preferred instrument because it's not as intrusive as banning practices. It's just empowering the consumers, giving information so that you can make a choice, fine, perfect. But now with these developments that we just talked about with artificial intelligence, automated decision makings, algorithms, transparency has come to its limits. So we need other tools to protect consumers. We need to inform them, still that's very important. We need them to understand what they're doing, also to take responsibility as far as possible, because if you don't understand how the market functions, if you're targeted and profiled, if you receive things and other things you don't receive because of your personal data that have been put into a profile, and if the products are maybe not even shown to you because you belong to a certain category and the algorithm says you're not in that category, so you're not evaluated in this way, so you cannot rely on information. So that's why we say we need other tools. We are looking into that. I think the GDPR has done a very good thing with the principle of privacy by default and by design, so that companies have to build in already in the design of the product or the service what is actually the legal standard. So I think that is the future. And let me say that this is not something that we will get with self-regulation, sorry to say. And even if European legislation takes a long time, we all know that, I don't think there is any valid alternative to areas where the protection is really necessary, where fundamental rights of people are at stake. You cannot leave that to ethical, self-regulatory things. You need to have decent regulation, even if it takes a little bit of time. We don't have any alternative on that. So I wouldn't want to leave these things to companies to decide themselves whether they want to do something decent and legally compliable with consumers or not. Thank you.
Okay. Well, time is up. So on that note, I want to thank you for coming to the event today, thank you to our online audience, and for the European Gaming and Betting Association for making it possible. So today we did say that there were some good in the consumer policies for the digital age, which is good news. But a lot has to be done on AI, so that's a challenge for next year, I guess, and the following years. This session is followed by EGBA's Responsible Gaming Day, which is taking place in this room from now until lunch, so you're more than welcome to stay. And you're also more than welcome to fill your evaluation forms. Thank you.
Okay, welcome everybody to the remainder of the day. My name is Dave Keating. I'm a journalist based here in Brussels. I am the Brussels correspondent for France 24 and Forbes, and I'm going to be guiding you guys through the rest of the day's discussions. Now, as we really head into the nitty-gritty here of Responsible Gaming Day, we're going to be talking about the area of EU legislation that is most pertinent to the online gambling sector, and that is protecting consumers from the risks inherent in gambling. We're going to talk about different approaches, what's working, what's not working, and also how the EU and national systems should approach these issues and whether they're best handled on a national level or on an EU level. Now, during the day, we're going to be tweeting. I encourage all of you to tweet your thoughts, and I'll be watching them and see if I can throw out some of your comments or observations during the panels. The hashtag for today is RGD 2018. That's Responsible Gaming Day. We're going to start with a study presentation, and then we're going to have two panels. First, looking at the tools that are available for player protection and what could possibly be developed for player protection. And then we're going to look at gambling advertising and how to protect consumers in the context of gambling advertising. So to kick off the discussion, I would like to invite Margaret Curran from the City University London to present her study on consumer protection in online gambling. Margaret?
Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you very much for allowing me to introduce my study. Just very quickly, as I only have been allocated 10 minutes, what was the study about? The study was essentially looking at the EU Commission recommendations 2014-478, which aimed to, in some ways voluntarily, nudge the member states to harmonize their online regulations with regards to online gambling. The recommendation itself, of course, is a voluntary instrument. It's a non-binding on member state. It's something that member states should consider but do not have to as such adhere to. Having said that, it's important to note that the recommendation was not supposed to be entirely ignored. And one of the aspects that I'm sure has been hoped to be achieved by the commissions with regards to the regulation of online gambling was to some level of homogeneity with regards to the gambling regulations between member states. With regards to the regulation as such, we know that online gambling has largely escaped any attempts at harmonization. There are some regulations which, of course, include gambling services to which gambling providers have to comply with, and that would include anti-money laundering, the data protection regulation, some other consumer protections. But overall, most of the gambling regulations has been decided at the local level and by the national member states, which essentially meant that the regulation has varied quite dramatically. And it has been hoped that the recommendations perhaps may reduce some of the diversity and the variations of the level of protections that the consumer get, depending on the jurisdictions that they are in. So the European Gaming and Betting Association has asked me if I was able to make the review, and the purpose was to essentially collect data with regards to the extent to which the member states have implemented some of the provisions of the recommendations, especially with regards to the identification of the players, minors protections, and social responsibility measures. We also tried to identify if the recommendation has succeeded in nudging the member state to achieve a greater conformity. And finally, we also looked at what the EU Commission is planning to do or what it's going to do in the future with regards to gambling-related activities, and also to elucidate some of the cooperation agreements that exist between member states. So as I already indicated, the study was commissioned in terms of disclosure, and it's of course fully funded by the European Gaming and Betting Association, but other than that, there are no other conflict of interest. So what are my conclusions? In the 10 minutes, it's very difficult to go through 28 countries. It would give me a grand total of 32 per country, so I can't do that. But in terms of very broad conclusion, if we think that the recommendations was hoping to achieve greater harmonizations on a voluntary basis, it has not done so. The recommendation, many member states are offering a high level of consumer protections. Many member states have got lots of regulations, but they are significantly divergent and significantly varied from state to state. And even when broad principles appear similar, in details, they are completely different. And that has two consequences. The first consequence is that the consumers will experience a very different level of protection depending on which jurisdictions they choose to gamble, with which operators they choose to gamble with. The second one, the operators, of course, have to essentially comply with the myriads of regulations that it's completely different from one place to another, even though some of the differences don't seem to have any major justification in substance. With regards to cooperations, there are cooperation agreements. We have the cooperation arrangements that has been entered into in 2015 and signed by almost every European countries, but they remain voluntary, and they remain within the scope of the member state to decide how to apply and its scope, which essentially the voluntary nature prevents them from being able to issue effective binding decisions and ensure the actual compliance by all member states, which hinders their effectiveness. So just to give some sort of an outline with regards to what the findings are, with regards to the players' identifications and verification requirements, the recommendations, of course, recommended that all online players are supposed to open an account, and this is probably one that is the most uniformly applied. So the obligations to open a gambling account in order to play is imposed in 25 countries mandatorily. In the 2 countries that do not have a specific regulations that regulates online gambling, they have regulations for gambling for land-based, but not online specifically, then the operators that are permitted to offer in those places, they all do it voluntarily. Of course, the Netherlands is still prohibiting gambling, so they are essentially excluded from any of those provisions. So that's why most of the numbers will add up to 27 or less. With regards to temporary accounts, that was one of the other recommendations. The temporary accounts are permitted in 17 jurisdictions, but the differences between the temporary accounts vary dramatically as well. So the duration vary from 72 hours in UK, for example, to when the anti-money laundering legislation triggers the verifications. The most popular time period for the temporary accounts is, of course, 30 days, but there are other terms and conditions that apply as well. no country allows withdrawals in the interim period. However, 7 countries do not permit temporary accounts, and 3 do not regulate the matter at all. With regards to the verification method, one of the important recommendations was for countries to offer a nationally standardized electronic verification system. And 4 countries have done so, but if we think about it, 4 out of 27, that is relatively limited. Most of the other countries, in fact 12, rely on reference to national databases. Some of them are facilitated by the national authorities, some are simply referred to by the operators because they are available and are permitted, and they are permitted to do so. 6 countries, however, still insist on manual verifications of online players, so they do not have, or they do not allow electronic identification of the players. With regards to the minors' protection, again, the recommendations recommended minimum age limits, that there should be age requirement, and this is something that every country has implemented, every country with legal online gambling, of course, but this is where the similarity ends, because even with something as fundamental as the minimum age, the member states don't seem to agree. Admittedly, the majority set it uniformly at the 18 years of age, which is the legal age of majority. However, there are some exceptions, and the exceptions apply in 5 jurisdictions, depending on the type of online gambling, and range from 16 to 21 years of age. No underage gambling sign in commercial communication, and this relates to essentially warning anyone in gambling advertising that gambling is only permitted to those who are of a certain age. This is only required in 12 countries, which make it mandatory for this sign to be shown either on the advertisement if it is in print, or during the advertisement if it is in the other media. Many other countries will have other restrictions, primarily relating to content and watershed restrictions, but only 12 actually insist on the sign, essentially the kite mark, so to say, to be on those adverts. With regards to educational activities that specifically target minors and specifically target online gambling, the study has identified none, which is perhaps not surprising because most of the activity would be included as part of overall educational and campaigns with regards to gambling risk as such. But having said that, even those, only 8 jurisdictions reported to carry them out in a more regular and systematic manner, as opposed to making them entirely ad hoc. The other aspect, the final one, with regards to the protection of vulnerable players, and our keynote speaker in the introduction already said how important it is to have self-exclusions and also self-exclusion registers. With regards to self-exclusion schemes, 23 jurisdictions require operators to offer self-exclusion, and in the further 3, that self-exclusion is offered by the operators voluntarily. However, with regards to the national registers, only 14 jurisdictions have a national self-exclusion registers. So all of the other jurisdictions that do require self-exclusion schemes, they essentially require the operators to implement their own processes and their own procedures. In terms of who can initiate self-exclusions, again, differences are significant. In 12 jurisdictions, self-exclusions can be initiated only by the affected players. Who wants to self-exclude and needs to apply for it accordingly. However, in 11 countries, the self-exclusion can be initiated by third parties. And the third parties differ. In some countries, the self-exclusion can be initiated by the operators if social responsibility measure required. In other countries, it's the family members that can apply for self-inclusion. Some countries require a court order before that can be actions. Other countries do not require court order, but the gambling commissions or the relevant gambling authorities will make the decision. In 2 countries, there are certain individuals who are barred from gambling by statute, and they are automatically included on the national self-exclusion register. And in 1 country, there are certain professions which are also barred because of the membership of the profession. So with regards to duration and revocability, again, durations incredibly varies. This is something that was probably the most difficult one to make sense out of it, because especially as member states do not adopt the definitions of timeout, which is the 24-hour break from gambling, and as self-exclusions, which is supposed to last for not less than 6 months. And self-exclusions is referred to completely different durations, starting from 7 days, 30 days, 3 months to 3 years, and permanent. So with regards to temporary self-exclusion, 11 states permit revocations before it expires, subject to certain terms and conditions. Permanent self-exclusions can be revoked in all countries, but again, the actual terms and conditions vary from state to state as to how many days has to pass, what is the requirement, is there a cool-off period before the terminations can be affected. And finally, with regards to the self-exclusion registers, as I've already mentioned, only 14 jurisdictions have national self-exclusions. In 2 countries, the self-exclusions exist and the operators are granted access and are permitted to do so, but they are not as yet required to consult it. And no jurisdiction allows access to the self-exclusion registers to licensees from other countries, and that's primarily because, of course, in Europe there is no mutual recognition principle that applies to gambling licenses. So in my very short period, my time is up, I think the key operative word with regards to the recommendation is availability. That there are many countries which offer high level of protections. There are many countries which impose significantly stricter rules than the recommendations require. There are some countries who don't regulate the matter at all. But overall, it is fair to say that the recommendation has not succeeded in nudging the countries to convert their online gambling regulations. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Margaret. Now we're going to dive into discussing these issues and what tools are available for player protection. We're very fortunate to have some very experienced people here on the stage with us. So all the way to my right, we have Jesper Karbrink, who you already know from the introduction. He's the Chief Executive Officer for Mr. Green, an EGBA member. Then to my right, we have Maris Bonello, Head of Player Sustainability, Research and Integrity at Kindred Group, another EGBA member. To my left, we have Susanna Campuzano, from the Responsible Gambling Unit in the Directorate General for the Regulation of Gambling in Spain, so she can tell us from the regulator's perspective. And finally, we have Matt Zarb-Cousin, co-founder of Gambin. It's an app developer. It's an app you can use to block yourself from accessing gambling sites. And we will shortly be joined by Miriam Dali, MEP from Malta. Thank you so much for joining us here today. Jesper, let me start with a question for you. From your perspective, being involved in the sector, what do you see as the biggest challenges in keeping people safe in online gambling?
I would say that the biggest challenge comes from the product in itself. We all know that this is for like 99% of the population, this is a fantastic entertainment product. But for 1%, it isn't. And of course, being a commercial company, you're trying to sell as much as possible. That goes with nature. But at the same time, we know that there are a certain amount of our players. And we should remember that the 1% is in the population. That's not with the gaming company. We have more like 12-15% of our players are problematic gamblers. So, and therein lies the biggest challenge, to get an organization like mine to understand that it has to be a balance between selling and not selling. Because we don't want, from a branding perspective and from a sustainability perspective, we don't want to have these people becoming in debt or destroying their lives due to our product. At the same time, we have a fantastic product for those who can manage it. So finding this balance is a challenge. That's more on a philosophical level. And then we, of course, have the challenge with different regulations, as we heard of here, in different countries and different markets. But that's more of a practical challenge, and that we can handle.
Maris, let's turn to you. What do you see as the main challenges, and how does that play into the overall regulatory structure like Jesper was mentioning?
I think one of the main challenges that we see is not just the regulations, that we have different responsible gambling tools, different requirements, but also we as operators, sometimes some of us will just give responsible gambling as a lip service. So for example, in a study that me and Mark Griffiths did, we saw that, okay, you know, you have to offer a responsible gambling page, you have to offer this information. But 44 out of 50 operators actually offered commercial information on this page. Mm-hmm. So you're getting information to protect yourself, but at the same time you have a pop-up saying, register now and you get a bonus. You have all this, we have this product, as you mentioned, which is so attractive. You can deposit online, you can play so many games, you can withdraw. But then some operators will offer the option to self-exclude by calling customer service. And it might take 72 hours to self-exclude. So I think we need to see as well a huge commitment from us, the operators, but also then from the regulators. So I'm a Maltese citizen, and if I want to self-exclude on a national basis, I can't do it. So even from an online perspective, if I have a customer that I see that has an addiction, an issue, I can't just tell him, listen, click here and you're safe. You won't be able to, you'll be able to self-exclude not only from Unibet and Maria, but also from Mr. Green. So we have to do collaborations, for example, with Gamban, where they can offer this. But Gamban is private, so it had to be our initiatives as well. So I think from a consumer protection perspective, we need more commitment to actually protect our consumers.
Well, Susanna, we've heard from the companies about what challenges they're facing in trying to protect consumers. From a regulator's point of view, what are the biggest challenges you're encountering in Spain?
Thanks. Well, from the regulator point of view, it's not that different from the ones of the operators, because it has not to be very different. But as online gambling is a very innovative sector, it has also are the challenges that we have. And for instance, we have different issues that we have to take care about, like more secure access to the gambling, like protecting even more the possible access to minors or self-excluded people. Now we have another challenge that we have even more data day by day, and that's the most important thing, that you have to use your data to know your customer in order to do it responsibly. Now you also have more knowledge, so you have to know, now you know which things work for responsible things and which doesn't. So which things don't. So you have also to do that. And just as a whole, or just to sum up, we consider that transparency has to be like the key piece of all of this, and the key piece in the sustainability of the sector, because otherwise the sector would not exist.
And Matt, Maris was mentioning a bit of the work that is possible with the private sector, with app developers. From your perspective, in having developed an app that can help people self-exclude from websites, what are the challenges that people in the private sector around the gambling companies trying to offer products like yours are encountering?
Well, I think that the issue for operators at the moment is that if, as Jesper said, it's 15% thereabouts that are experiencing problems of their customers, but they're contributing around 60% of gross gambling yield on average across the sector in Britain, certainly. I can only speak about a British context, and that's from the Gamble Aware study that PwC carried out. So it's about 60% of the revenue. Now, the problem with that model, with that business model, is unsustainable, not just in terms of having to get new customers all the time, because your main revenue source are constantly going broke, so you need to find new customers, but it's unsustainable on an existential level, because the more customers you have in the sector that are losing their homes, losing their livelihoods, committing crime to gamble, the more negative publicity there is and the more political clamour there is for a huge clampdown. And that is where it's heading in Britain at the moment. It's heading towards very, very punitive regulations on online gambling. I would even contend that the online gambling sector, if Labour gets into government, if they win the next election, there'll be a new Gambling Act, and the online gambling sector in Britain will look very, very different if that happens, if things don't change. And the challenge for online operators is that if they do anything unilaterally, if one operator says we're going to do to reduce harm that is effective, it will mean a reduction in gross gambling yield. And they don't want to do that because that will put them at a competitive disadvantage, right? Because if you're, if you're saying we're actually going to reduce harm, it means less profits and these customers will just go somewhere else. So Gamban really occupies the space where we can, an operator can give a license that blocks gambling sites on all devices and is designed so it can't be uninstalled by the user. And really that doesn't put the operator at any commercial disadvantage because the customer's already self-excluded, and if we give the license to, if they give a license away for Gamban, then it just means that they're protected and self-excluded from all gambling sites and apps. Now our theory broadly for doing this is we believe that in order for self-exclusion to be effective, it has to be joined up, so you have to have these online registers, and that's about the player. It has to be layered as well. So on the device, ours is on the device, it's device specific, it blocks from the device, and you can't uninstall it. And then we want to, we're working with the financial sector for transaction blocking as well. And then eventually we'll move on to internet service providers and mobile networks. And if you have all those layers, it's very difficult to circumvent. And then once you have that effective self-exclusion, then there's an incentive for operators to prevent harm, prevent that customer from experiencing harm during their player journey, because they don't want them to get to the point where they have to self-exclude and they lose that customer forever. So that's kind of the long-term vision, but that's, as I say, it's very difficult for operators to do things unilaterally that are going to be effective.
Well, Susanna, let me put that question to you, because obviously for an app like Matt's, that's only going to be used by someone who already recognizes that they have a pretty serious problem. For you as a regulator, is it more important to target those players that are either at high risk or already have a serious problem, or is it more important to target all people that are using gambling sites and kind of nip it in the bud before a gambling problem develops? If you had to choose one or the other, which is the more important focus?
Well, I think that, in my opinion, responsible gambling cannot be something that can be distinguished between groups of people or groups of players. Sorry. So it's something that has to be overall. For instance, in our organization, in overall the units of the organization, all the measures that you take, you have to keep that in mind. First, basically because of two reasons. First, because gambling can create an addiction, but not always, but it also can. But can, and you never know when, in the sense that you cannot say, I have this percentage of problematic gamblers, and it's something fixed. Because something, maybe she or he, today he is not, or she is not, but today maybe she is. And also because something of the related with responsible gambling and related with players is something that is very personal, in the sense that it's very difficult, and a lot of articles and papers have shown this, that it's very difficult to find very common things and particular things like, okay, if you have this and this and this and this and this, you're going to be a more prone person to have an addiction problem, because maybe that works for me but not for the other one. So I think in answering your question is something that you cannot just distinguish between groups, and something that has to be just on the top of all the decisions that you take. And also for our situation is also different from the one that he was describing, because for us in Spain we already have the one of the countries that has a self-exclusion register as a whole statewide, as she mentioned. So that's different, because the self-exclusion register is something for the persons or for the people that they already know that they have a problem. But now we also have to look forward to the people that is not yet there.
How about for the companies? Do you guys prefer that, well, either for your own strategies or for the regulatory approach, is it better to develop approaches that target the entirety of your user base, or wait until problems develop?
No, for us this is quite given, and I agree with Matt. we are running an unsustainable business model. Sorry. To start with, I agree with Matt. We are running an unsustainable business model at this time, meaning that we have a rather high churn and we are aggressively recruiting new customers. And eventually, that's not sustainable. Long term, it's impossible to be. So we have to change our business model and we have to change our view on the business. And that means that we would like to have these players playing. I mean, we love them being customers with us and playing, but we don't want them to play too much. And as we heard saying here, this is a customer journey. This is something that develops, and you don't know when you start becoming a bit too aggressive and speeding up your gambling a bit too much. And so we have built a tool, we call it the Green Gaming Predictive Tool, and it's a predictive tool. It follows you from the day you start playing. Every single spin is registered, and we have a data model predicting your risk level. And this risk level, we don't keep this to ourselves, we show this to our customers in their face, that you are now on the way to an amber, and then we adjust our offering, our communication. So we will launch now the first quarter this year a new lobby system, and that is a 1-1 lobby. So if I'm more prone to playing casino games, I will have more of a casino feeling and sportsbook and vice versa. But we also, in that lobby, building in the green gaming data. So if I am green, my lobby will look different than if I'm amber or red. We will embed more responsible gaming communication in that lobby. So it should start from the beginning. And as Matt is saying, banning and self-excluding, that's the last resort. But GamBan is a fantastic tool for that, but we want to prevent, actually we want to make Matt going out of business eventually, because we want to make sure that they don't end up in banning. And I'm probably one of the few that really are keen on UKGC's affordability thinking. Can I afford to play? How much can I afford to play? We could actually be one of the first industries in the world that are acting on what people could afford to offer or lose with us. And I think that's a good thing if we can do that, because then we should have normal players. And sorry, and the last thing, we also see this now, there's a pretty strong drift towards consolidation. And I think consolidation will help, because the smaller the casinos are, the more dependent they are on this risk level of players. If you're I'm coming from Svenska Spel. I mean, we had like 75% of the Swedish grown-up population as players, which means that we have a huge base of recreational players. If a couple of VIPs, if we block them or not, it didn't really matter. So the larger you are, the more easy it is to handle these problems, which also is, so the consolidation we see right now is also a good thing from a player perspective.
Well, we've just been joined by Miriam Dali, one of our hosts. I just want to catch you up quickly. So we've been talking about some of the challenges inherent in trying to keep players safe. Let me ask you, from a legislator's perspective, particularly on a European level, what are the challenges that legislators here in Brussels are facing when they're trying to tackle this problem? This morning we heard from Commissioner Jourova that up till now, gambling addiction has been dealt with as a health problem, and health is kind of a complicated issue when you're talking about EU competence versus national competence. Now we're thinking about approaching it as a single market issue. As an EU legislator, what are the challenges in tackling this problem?
First of all, excuse me for arriving a bit late. So from the policy perspective, what I am particularly interested in is finding the right balance, which is easy to say, but more complex to actually achieve in real terms and when you try and legislate in a concrete way. But if I had to start, so I'll go back just one step. What I am particularly interested in is that we have a thriving industry, but not at the expense of its own customers. And I think that industry itself is on board with this, or at least the general feeling is that they want to protect their consumers as well. And I believe that that is the main message that we need to push forward, because in my view, a business case that would make most sense is for gaming companies to have repeat customers, healthy customers that come and do not end up in a situation where they have been ridden with debts or with other problematic issues, and you end up in a situation where you have a customer for a short period of time, he or she leaves you and you need to start afresh with new customers. But as you are rightly pointing out, whilst everyone seems to agree with this balancing act that needs to be reached, when it comes to how we legislate about that, it becomes more of a complex issue. I tend to disagree with looking at it as just a health issue. It can have health implications, but as far as I'm concerned, implications go well beyond that. So we need to make sure which avenue we use to actually legislate and have the proper regulation in place. I'm saying it's easier said than done because even on the European Parliament level, when we try to have a resolution vis-à-vis this, we, as Parliament, there was an attempt to push something in this direction which did not necessarily fly the way we wanted. So I do understand that there are these like tug-of-wars because having too much of a protection can be burdensome, but at the same time, we need to make sure that we protect our customers. Looking at it from a single market point of view can work. It depends, obviously, how you legislate, how you regulate in that regard, what kind of legal provisos you would have to make sure you don't stifle the industry, but at the same time, we make sure that we protect consumers. Now, I don't know if you went into the area of self-regulation, but I heard at one point that you were mentioning that. I think self-regulation vis-a-vis from the player's perspective, there are players with whom self-regulation can work. They can self-control, apply to these tools, but I'm not convinced that it would work across the board because we have to make a distinction between players and gamblers, as applies also in the physical world. So sometimes, even when we speak about education, I'm not really comfortable in saying just we need to educate online gaming. It goes well beyond that. So we need to make sure that we take advantage of all the technological developments. We need to take advantage of all the innovative apps, artificial intelligence, all the innovative technological tools, but at the same time try to reach this balance. I'm particularly interested to understand the different perspectives in this scenario, but what I would like to definitely see is that we exploit in a positive way the full potential of the technological tools that exist so that we can have an industry that thrives whilst at the same time we make sure that we protect as much as possible consumers, understanding that you have persons for whom a gambling addiction is more of an issue and they can be more prone to gambling addictions than others.
Maris, let me put a question to you. This morning, Commissioner Jourova said, reacting to Jesper's speech, it's not often that she has an industry coming to her and asking for more EU regulation, or at least transferring from national to EU level. How much of a hindrance is it right now that the regulation around online gambling, particularly when it comes to consumer protection, is so national? Would you prefer to see it taking place at more of an EU level?
I think for us, from a practical level, it's needed because it's a pain. There's no other way to describe it. Like, for example, Kindred, we have different regulations, but we know that one regulator, you have to promote a spending limit, but then another regulator, it's a deposit limit. And then another one, I'm sure now there will be another one who say no loss limit. And just something on a practical level, it drives our team crazy. But then on something that maybe was even touched before, I think we're really forgetting that this is online gambling and that we have so much data available. So we should really embrace research. So I respectfully decline when previously it was mentioned we can't really see different groups, because we can. We can see, for example, chasing losses. We can see, for example, that the research papers that are being done are actually helping the industry. So, for example, something really trivial that can help so much is that Jonathan Park and Adrian Park did a study with GambleAware and using our data, and we saw that chasing winnings is actually more prominent with problematic behavior. So people start chasing that positive reinforcement. So that actually reinforced for us that if a customer wins, we should not only congratulate him, we should help him at that point not to lose his house. Because as Matt said, it's unsustainable. But it's not, okay, we hear a lot because most of the operators make so much money from a few gamblers, but that's because you're just seeing one aspect of it. It's not sustainable even for us. Our legal department can get super busy with these things. There's a lot of Twitter, Facebook, constant killing us on that. Is it really sustainable even on a practical level? So what we want, and I guess it's similar to Mr. Green, we want something that we want to use research and data to be able to detect, to be able to see when someone is losing a bit too much, to help them, because that's where the tools come in. And if the tools are good, you can help people stay in control. On a national level, it might not really work, because if you have a deposit limit on a national level, it might be impractical. But at least it should be that every company operates the same way. So it's not a way of, okay, if I lose a bit too much on Kindred, someone will approach me, but I just know I can go on this operator and they will give me a bonus. So that's also a factor.
Makes sense. Let me check quick. Do we have any questions from the audience? Would anyone like to ask a question to our panelists? Yes, in the back here.
I'm Mark Griffiths from the UK, Director of the International Gaming Research Unit at Nottingham Trent University. I'd just like to ask the panel what they think is the most effective responsible gambling tool and why.
So what single tech, is it a technology, is it a method? What would you say is the single most effective one? Open to the panel. Matt?
I think the most effective single mechanism is to cap the stakes, because I think that, as the research has shown on fixed odds betting terminals, the higher someone the more someone gambles per spin, the more likely they are to be experiencing harm. There are some remote sites like Tombola who already cap the stakes at £2 a spin, and I think that was probably the most effective way of preventing harm and reducing harm for those already experiencing it.
Yes. Well, I think it's a bit what Mario said here is using research and data and put that into the product, because we have a lot of models and data where we predict churn to keep these players, and exactly the same tools can be reversed, and we can use that to predict who's playing too much. And in that sense, as we heard also earlier, nudge them in a positive way early in the process. And then I also think limits is asking the customer to set limits, or perhaps even sometimes force them to set limits based on what they can afford to lose, should be a very, very strong tool, because it's my decision, I set the limit, and I have to live up and follow that limit. And then I also think that there should be an understanding for when someone is setting a limit that is a bit out of proportion based on their game patterns and things like that, and we could once again nudge them down in the right direction. So limits is a practical tool, but data and research, and build that in, as I said in the keynote earlier, build that into our products. That's the key. That's a long-term key for making this business sustainable again.
Susanna?
Yeah, just saying that data, the use of data and the research and knowing your consumer from the operator's point of view. And I would like to pointalize, maybe because I didn't explain properly, maybe when I was saying that I didn't refer that you don't have like the data to know who could be in the red, orange, or green part of the table. I just wanted to say that there's not one recipe that fits all. That's the only thing that I wanted to say. Not that the data cannot allow you to distinguish between different kinds of gamblers.
With the capping of the stake, I think it really depends on the situation and structure characteristics. So it can't be really applied to everything, because you can have a capping on lottery, but we know that it's perhaps less risky than a FOPT, obviously. I think I would echo what Jesper is saying, that yes, of course, more detection, more research, but also more commitment internally. Yes. You need to see that you can't have, your responsible gambling team doing certain approaches, promoting certain tools, and then you have your marketing team bombarding the same people in a certain way. So I can't really answer Mark's question. I would say everything, but yeah.
Sorry, could I add one more thing on that note? And I think that's very important. That is that we embed the responsible gaming messaging in the communication tools we have. I mean, communications are today sent automated in, depending on where I am in the customer journey. And that communication should differ from a player being on the low risk level or a medium risk level or a high risk level, and really reusing that in the marketing communication, or actually taking out a bit of the marketing communication. So that is also a very, very strong tool, I think.
What I would like to see probably in an ideal world is that if you have a player that is self-excluded or excluded, doesn't move from one platform to another easily, but that self-exclusion or exclusion is somehow communicated between the different platforms, because that, in my view, would offer the utmost protection. Because you cannot self-exclude or exclude a person from one platform, but if he or she has the possibility to move around, I think that defeats the whole purpose.
But I suppose the problem with that is, I mean, a lot of you have pointed out data solutions, AI tracking user behavior. There's, of course, privacy concerns that go along with that. How do you develop those data solutions while at the same time respecting your customers' privacy?
I think I can answer that one based on experience. We built our Green Gaming Predictive Toolkit and wanted to have this as a mandatory. Everyone that plays with us should be monitored with this tool, and we should in their face tell them what risk level they are on. But with GDPR, we were advised by our lawyers that we couldn't do that. We had to have a consent. We have to have an explicit consent and explicit terms and conditions for this, which means that it's an opt-in. We are now removing this opt-in in Sweden due to the Swedish legislation over-trumping the GDPR with the omsorgsplikt, whatever it is, duty of care, part of regulation. So we can now have this as mandatory in Sweden. We will also launch it as mandatory in UK after discussions with our lawyers and with UKDC. But there is a conflict, absolutely, because at some point you could say that we are making a diagnosis. I don't think we are. I think we are just risk profiling, but you could argue that. And then it becomes more tricky when it comes to the Data Protection Act. So yes, those are kind of a bit contradictory today.
Miriam, would you say GDPR is getting in the way of these solutions?
I would say let's find ways and means how we get the two together. But yes, it is. I wouldn't call it a stumbling block, but it is an issue that needs to be addressed. But if we really want to truly address this, I would call it a problem, because when you have players who have a gambling problem and they are at risk, you need to address that issue. So we need to see how we find ways and means how to go about it.
What about Susanna, from the regulator's perspective, are these privacy concerns top of mind or less so? And are you guys encountering any problems with GDPR interpretation?
Well, I totally agree with Jesper in saying that it's a very tricky question, and that's a very tricky situation, because you have to keep in mind that you have to protect, of course, the personal data, but at the same time you have a public health issue on your hands, so that's very difficult. And for instance, we just think about that. I just posed this question to the floor, like, which kind of invasion on the private data could be, for instance, if one operator has data on one customer, like, for me, this customer is red, let's say, just for summarize. Could it be possible or desirable, if you want, to change that data to other operator, to make, let's say, a general data of responsible gambling? It's just a question but it has a lot to do with the personal data and the health public issue that you are having on your hands. That's very complicated.
Yes, and not being on the floor, but anyway, taking the question. Absolutely. I mean, having exclusion, national-wide exclusion register is a good thing, but once again, that's a last resort. Then they are red, they are burned. So we should try to avoid that. And of course, and this is also a problem, a typical gambler has 4 accounts. So in our data, he is green, or she is green, because she plays for like 5-10% of her gaming wallet with us. That's also why we are asking questions. We are also having them to make a self-assessment. So, and those self-assessments are more often than you could believe, very true. People don't lie to themselves that much. So they come up red. But if we only have the data, they could be green with us. And we just flood them with information and send them more and more bonuses and push them to play. While with Kinder, they are super red. And this is a problem. And of course, for this to work in total balance, we should have a kind of a national-wide or European Union-wide database on where they are on the risk level. I think that's, unfortunately, is practical, very, 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 very difficult, or perhaps even impossible. But once again, that's also why we as an operator has to take a responsibility. We cannot only rely on the data. We also have to ask the customers the question, how do you perceive your risk level? And by that, we can calibrate these things. But it's a tricky question, definitely.
We have time for one more quick
Can I
question.
just come in on that
from
quickly?
the Oh, yes. Let me just check first. Do we have any last question? Okay, Matt, go for it.
Yeah, no, just what I was going to say. I think the banks are in a much better position to be doing this because the banks have access to transactional data for all the sites that someone gambles on, not just one. And there are some banks, challenger banks now, like Monzo, where you can block gambling transactions, and if you wanted to switch that off, then you have to have a 7-day calling off period, and you have to phone them up, and just puts friction in the way. There's a lot of the barriers of friction have been really broken down over in gambling in the last 20 years, like between consumer and operator. You know, you can, I don't know about different jurisdictions, but in Britain you can sign up to a gambling site, deposit money, and gamble without even showing age verification. You know, it's so quick, everything's so quick. So putting that friction in the way, particularly if people have problems, is a massive help.
And are you encountering GDPR problems so far from the app's perspective?
No, nothing from our perspective.
Okay, well, that's good to hear.
Yeah.
on that positive, yep.
On this point, that to have like a national detection system, I think it has to be led by a regulator, not by us as the operators. First of all, I'm very cynic of some operators, so I think they would use it as a VIP detection, not a problem detection. And then on another level, I mean, it's true. They are sometimes, hindering factors where you have to verify yourself and do those things. But people get used to these things as well. We got used to this at the airport, in all fairness. If, for example, let's say today everyone has to catch a flight, we don't go through security, all of us will complain because we won't feel safe. So I think it's also the messaging that we portray. So for example, within Kindred, we have a similar system to green gaming. Actually, with us, everyone goes through it. It could be the lawyers are very good. And when a customer is detected, we build a profile on that customer. So there's the humanistic approach. And that is mainly putting data and then practicality into place together. So it's a very tentative, early on, perhaps. It's very innovative at the moment, but I'm sure that if we get the best heads together, we can make these hurdles avoidable.
I just need a short comment there. We run all the data on all we are obliged to run all the responsible gaming data on all customers. But what we do with the Green Gaming Toolkit is that we present this data to the customer on their profile. And then it's when it becomes a tricky GDPR issue, ironically enough. But running the data and following the players in the background in the responsible gaming team, that's not the problem. That's totally within GDPR. So we can't say that GDPR is blocking responsible gaming. Absolutely not. But presenting it to the player in their face, so to speak, that's where we have run into an issue. So we have kind of two versions, one internally that we've been running for years, and then the new one externally where we present this to the player. Yes.
Great. Well, I want to thank all of our panelists for a very interesting discussion. How about a round of applause for them?
Thank you.
And now we'll move on to our next panel on advertising. You guys can go ahead and take a seat, and if I could ask the people on the second panel to come up now and join us on stage. Thanks a lot, guys. So our second panel is on advertising. And of course, when you talk about protecting consumers and users, you're talking about protecting them during the online gambling experience, but there's also a role that advertising plays in bringing people to those online sites and possibly bringing people with gambling problems back to online sites when they shouldn't be there. And so this is a tricky issue that we're going to delve into with this illustrious panel before me here. So let me introduce all of them. First of all, we have Paul Buck. He's Chief Executive Officer with Epic Risk Management, which works with at-risk groups, and he also has a personal experience with this he can share with us. Then we have Apostolos Dousias, Chief Operating Officer from Betson Group, a member of EGBA. We have Juan Espinoza Garcia, Director at the Directorate General for the Regulation of Gambling in Spain. Professor Mark Griffiths from Nottingham Trent University, who's done research on responsible gambling, and Claire Pinson-Bessonnet from the European and Internal Affairs Officer from the Online Gaming Authority in France, who can give us the regulator's perspective on some of these advertising issues. So let's turn to Paul first. When we think about the challenges that are inherent in online gambling, from your perspective, what are the biggest challenges when it comes to protecting, particularly those at-risk and vulnerable groups?
Okay. Okay, I'll try and shout. Okay. I think there's a conundrum, isn't there, when it comes to online advertising or gambling advertising, because obviously from an operator point of view, people are wanting to get new customers, retain customers, but they need to do it in a socially responsible way. And I think that's the key at the moment. Certainly from a lot of the stuff we see in the UK, there's probably too many adverts and probably the tone of them is probably wrong in some instances as well. So I think the biggest challenges at the moment, the biggest implications if we don't get this right is around kids, the next generation. So a new study from the Gambling Commission came out last week that there's now 55,000 11 to 16-year-olds who are gambling problematically just in the UK. I think advertising probably has played a part in that with the tone of it and the amount that there are in there. I think also probably the normalisation with sport. Now we do a lot of work with sport, we do a lot of work with different sports teams, and we're doing a really large programme with the EFL and Sky Bet at the moment as well. But I think there's a role to play in there as well, but the normalisation of sport with 18 to 30-year-old men in particular, who perhaps statistically have got the most vulnerability. You know, there's probably work to do in there in terms of the tone and the message as well.
Let's hear from Apostolos next. In terms of the company perspective, what is your approach to advertising, and what are the challenges you're facing in making sure that the advertising isn't targeting the wrong people?
I think that one comes this way. So, as a company, obviously, we are an EGBA member as well, right? Similar to Kinder, similar to Mr. Green, similar to most of the respectable players out there in the industry, we try to make our utmost in order to comply both with what our regulators tell us that we should be doing in order to protect our customers and to protect minors and to protect against underage gambling. But obviously, we need to be taking a conscious approach in order to make sure that we do our utmost, not just what the regulator says. We do our utmost in order to protect the people who are vulnerable at all times. So that, if the regulator simply tells you you need an under 18 mark, we saw from the professor before, that some countries do not even need the under 18 on their marketing, on the commercial communications that are relating to gambling. But even if the regulator just asks you that, our company and in general the industry, the companies out there who take responsible gaming and customer protection seriously, they will go a step further. And that's the self-regulation of the industry itself. I'm not going to go into specifics like always telling the customer to play responsibly, adding the further steps, making advertisements that are not targeting acquisition, but are targeting in themselves the message that you need to stop when the gambling has gone too far. So that is the approach that Betson Group has adopted, but it is not unique to our group.
Juan, let's hear from you next. In terms of the regulator's perspective, what are the biggest challenges in dealing with advertising?
Thank you.
All kinds of problems with the mics.
Okay, thank you. I would say, in order not to repeat what has just been said earlier, I would place an even bigger challenge from a broader level when it comes to advertising and gambling, on the fact that in advertising, the industry is really reflecting the way it wants to relate with society in general. So, of course, protections of minors, protections of problem or heavy gamblers come at the forefront. But I would say from a wider perspective that there is indeed a challenge, and a very big one, in trying to sort out how society assimilates gambling via advertising. Advertising is the one canvas or playing field, if you wish, whereby gambling operators make themselves acquainted to society, not only to the people who actually gamble, but the rest of it. And so it's paramount that advertising, whether its frequency or the content itself, on both those dimensions, gives some comfort to society in general. The point has been made earlier that, or that it has been argued that the business model of gambling was maybe it could use a revision, and that the current business model being that there's a lot of incoming customers, only a few of them stay, but those who stay for good, and they are heavy players, not considering regardless or not, of whether they have a problem or not. And this is the model. But then, how are you going to shift the model, which, in my view, could only pass by widening the base a bit to customers, recreational customers, spending a bit more on this activity. If you're not to provide comfort to society that this activity, with all its problems, is well addressed by both operators and of course by the regulators. So I would say, summing up, that there's one challenge, but maybe it's not perceived at the forefront, but it's definitely a very intense one. Definitely it is in Spain, related to the general sustainability of the model and the activity when it comes to the advertising policy.
Well, Mark, you've done research into responsible gambling. What have you found about the role of advertising in affecting people's behavior?
Okay, this is a really tricky question as a researcher. I like everything to be evidence-based. One of the real problems we've got with all the advertising research is you can never do a definitive study which will show that, for instance, gambling advertisers causes problem gambling. That's one really big problem we've got. What we know about gambling advertising, we know that people, the general public, have a high awareness of gambling advertising. We know that problem gamblers say they're often, that when they see a gambling advert, that will often trigger them to go and gamble when they see a gambling advert. 3 years ago, we did, I think, the biggest study ever on gambling advertising. We did over 6,000 people. What we found in that, and of course this is self-report data, which is one of the real problems that we've got, because obviously there's lots of what we call biases with that kind of self-report data. Of those 6,000 plus people, we only had 57 problem gamblers out of that 6,000 people. But what those 57 were showing is that they had much greater awareness of gambling adverts. They were more likely to be triggered by seeing a gambling advert. But the problem is we're basing it on a very low number of problem gamblers. And this goes with any kind of prevalence research, because even if you do a survey of 10,000 people, you're only going to get maybe 100, 150 problem gamblers in that particular thing. So, the things that researchers do, of course, so I've published I've published about 10 papers over this last year or so on advertising, and we've particularly looked at the content of advertising, and I think Paul alluded to it in his answer, is that sometimes the content of advertising, I think, is exploiting gamblers. It's giving messages that are completely wrong. It's not actually presenting the truth about gambling and those kind of things, that's where regulation can come in, because I don't think you're ever going to get a piece of research that definitively shows that gambling is a major contributory factor to problem gambling. So in a way, when it comes to the kind of regulating of it, we have to, you know, we kind of have to do things on a common sense approach. Obviously, problem gamblers, it's very hard to regulate for them, but there are other groups. Paul also said about, we've just seen a report in the UK that said that children gambling, there was a significant increase over the last 2 years. And some people in the media, when I was asked about it, I actually thought it was actually more to do with things like the buying of loot boxes rather than advertising. But of course, we don't know. And advertising could be playing a role in children's gambling. And Paul will know this, Matt will know this about the UK, is we have a law in the UK, because I personally think that all gambling advertising should be after a 9 p.m. watershed, because gambling is an adult activity. But of course now, if you're organising a sports event, you are legally allowed to advertise gambling before, during, and after that sporting event. And I look at my own 3 screenagers. I've got 3 children, and they are we're a big sports family. I don't know how many adverts for instance, my youngest son, who is football mad, sees in a week. But it's got to be a minimum of 100 sports ads in a week. And, the vast majority of those will be on Saturday and Sunday watching all the football matches. Now, he's got a father who can educate him about gambling, but most people are not going to be in that situation. Sorry, I could go on and on and on, but I've raised a lot of issues there that we could pick up.
Did you use the term screenagers?
Yeah.
Is that I love that term.
Well, I've been using it since 1991. It's kind of catching on in some way. Yeah, well, all my children spend a disproportionate part of their day in front of screen.
It makes sense. It's very millennial. Yeah, I like this. Let's make it happen. So finally, Claire, from the regulator's perspective, what have been the challenges for you in, A, figuring out how much advertising is really influencing people's behavior, and B, how do you regulate it?
Okay, well, in terms of challenges, probably, finding the right balance between publicizing the activity of legal gambling operators and an exaggerated inducement to gamble is the main challenge. Advertising, commercial communication, not specifically targeting underage and young adult populations. But something that sustains information about gambling and without leading to excessive gambling. In that view, the provisions of the European Commission recommendation are balanced. But this balance between informative communications and commercial communications has to be reached while commercial communications are evolving towards online community animation and content editing on social networks, which is targeting minors actually and younger population. And this balance has to be a stroke within a transitional period between direct advertising and indirect advertising. And so probably the challenge is also the digitalization of gambling commercial communications. What we do in France in terms of gambling advertising regulation, first we regulate commercial communications of the operators, which widens the scope of our national regulation. We are 2 regulatory authorities in charge of implementing commercial communication regulations, ARGEL, so the Online Gambling Regulatory Authority, and the French Superior Audiovisual Council for everything which is linked to TV and radio broadcastings. On the top of that, we have a co-regulation, because there is also the National Association of Advertisers that adopted in as early as 2009 a code of conduct, and it represents 75% of the top 100 advertisers in France. So we have a system of co-regulation. And we have, regulation in place. Advertising for an illegal gambling offer for an illegal gambling offer is a criminal offense, but advertising for a legal gambling offer which wouldn't be compliant with a regulatory framework is also a criminal offense. Specifically, according, well, there are, of course, I mean, well, a serial of regulatory measures, namely to protect minors, and those are specified by decrees. But well, those mostly correspond to what the recommendation of the European Commission. I mean, we have in our regulatory framework most of what the European Commission recommendation suggested in 2014. Still, and that would be the same remark maybe. For the wording and the provisions in the European Commission recommendation. When it comes to minors, for example, we have provisions preventing the exposure of minors to gambling. So no commercial communication within or close to TV programs, especially intended for minors. Or no commercial communication with heroes or personalities or that are particularly attractive to minors. But there again, I mean, we were talking about football, for example. Can we consider that a professional football star player is something that, that can be under the definition of a personality particularly appealing to minors? And it's exactly the same question that can be asked also for the according to the provision of the recommendation when it comes to sponsorship. And we've been discussing that with the European Commission already when talking about the recommendation in the expert group on gambling services. What is exactly merchandising dedicated to minors? So again, I opened up on more European issues. Just to mention something else, there is the audiovisual regulation, there is the gambling regulation, but at any in any case and at any stages, there are harmonized instruments that can be that can apply also to gambling advertising, which are, for example, the directive on misleading advertising or the directive on unfair commercial practices.
Let me ask a question to Apostolos and Juan, just to kind of set the framework here. When you guys advertise, what is the intention of the advertisement? Are you trying to recruit new customers, or are you reminding people who already gamble, come back to us and gamble, or switch who you're gambling with? Who's your target audience?
I think that this is a key question here, because we do hear quite a lot of this discussion focusing on the minors, but it is not, clearly it is not the minors that we are targeting. Clearly it is not the minors that any gambling company which operates under a framework would want to be targeting, right? So, of course, acquisition is always there. We are a commercial. We are all commercial vehicles. Same way that other business wants to attract customers, we want to attract customers. But it is not not to be now brutally not to be a little bit nonchalant on this. But it's not the 18 or 19-year-olds that will make your company gain a lot of profits. It's a different. The spending power of an 18-year-old or a 19 or a 20-year-old is different to the spending power of a 35-plus-year-old, right? At least that's my impression. So the commercial aspect, the commercials, what we are trying to achieve is that you, in essence, have the customers circulating between your competitor, and in general, the commercials and the advertisement is focusing around the product and the competitive advantages that you have over another individual who is already playing. Now, I want to just mention one more aspect on that. The way that we are, the way that the industry should be advertising, and the way that, this is not Betson Group, this is my personal opinion, but Betson Group does welcome the regulation, and we I think, as an individual, I also believe a lot that we should have a framework, a regulatory framework that is ensuring that we are all playing on the same field with the same regulations and with the same principles, protecting the consumer, protecting the customer. Without, of course, as the Commissioner mentioned at the beginning, without forgetting that the individual also has a personal responsibility. And if at some points the individual has a personal responsibility, and at some other points the person who is responsible for the upbringing of the individual has also a responsibility till that person turns 18. So we should not forget that regulatory framework and that way of common sense approach, in my opinion. And just, I don't want to take too much of the time, but on what you asked me on how do we advertise and why do we advertise, we would welcome a framework where the acquisition that targets both the acquisition of players from the perspective of new customers who have not yet gambled, and that is one particular set of advertising, and then the acquisition of players from competitors, which is the biggest chunk of what is happening with advertising. Now, it is important in this discussion to remember, as in this panel I'm the only one from an operator perspective, but before there was Maris and Jesper from other operators, and they clearly, I feel, for me that I am inside the industry, they clearly set the tone on the level of customer protection that we are trying to achieve ourselves. So also from an operator perspective, when we advertise, we do take into consideration that the customer who will join us will not be able to spend a fortune unless we have age verified, KYC, which is the Know Your Customer process, risk assessed for anti-money laundering issues, ensure that the deposit method belongs to him, ensure that the potential withdrawal method belongs to him, have a full background both on RG and on Know Your Customer and on AML, on anti-money laundering. So these are things that we should not take out of the equation, because the same way our colleague here from the regulator mentioned the criminal responsibilities, the criminal liabilities on us. We are licensed operators, and that is something that is very, very, very important. And last point, there is the point of why we are advertising in a regulated market, because the customers need to know that Betson, Kindred, Unibet in this case, Mr. Green, are regulated operators. They are legal operators. Because otherwise, what will differentiate us between a regulator that has not had a license in the specific reg? How will the consumer know that Betson.com or BetSafe.com is fully regulated and Apple has, which is my short name, has a full liability versus a company that is operating from another territory or within that territory but does not have a license?
So let's see if it's compatible here. One, from a regulator's perspective, what do you see as the purpose of advertising? And do you think, is part of the problem that you think that gambling companies are deliberately targeting problematic customers or not?
Well, a brief answer to the second question, and I will expand after I answer the first one. I think it may be the case in some particular, regarding some particular practices, but this doesn't exhaust the range of potential problems related to advertising. And I will leave it that for a minute. What is the purpose from a regulatory perspective of advertising? And of course, bearing in mind that in principle, any objective that operators might have to advertise their products is legitimate as such, per se. From a regulatory perspective, and quite frankly, the advertising tool is, or has been perceived so far, at least to be the key or the one key element for the regulated offer, specifically, or most notably in an online environment, the regulated offer to be acquainted in society by potential customer versus the non-regulated offer in a particular country or jurisdiction. And by this I mean that it has been perceived to be a key instrument for channelization of a part of the consumption that was already taken place in countries like mine, like Spain, 7, 8, 5 years ago, coming from the unregulated offer, and trying to divert this consumption to the regulated offer. Advertising is the way operators, licensed operators, have to make themselves acquainted to people. It's in the end, these operators pay some money in taxes, in guarantees, comply, or at least try to comply with a whole range of requirements, both technical, legal, personal probity, and the like. And the only differential instrument they have against the unregulated offer is advertising. So this is the purpose of allowing advertising. What it is about, of course, or what we need to make sure of is that this practice is sustainable, of course, and it doesn't come to the expense or to the detriment of providing for unhealthy consumer patterns and practices. So coming back to your second question, which was the first one, I would say that by and large, both targets, the two possible targets of an advertising practice in gambling, you have raised them perfectly. It's either getting new customers, whether new customers or new customers to me coming from a different operators. This is one practice which yields one set of issues, and a different practice, or trying to maintain an existing customer already of my own. I would say that with the first practice, by and large, this is generalizing, but with the first practice, this is the one I would have more trouble relating to specific patterns of problematic behavior. As has been said earlier, it's difficult to place a causality strictly between the advertising and generating a problem. And this is all the more true in the first pattern. But the problem is, or the issue with this practice is that it's really prominent in society. This is where all the, let's say, evident aggressiveness and perpetuous exposure to advertising comes from. Lots of operators wanting to reap their share of customers. So allegedly, very intense advertising practice. The problem is, well, society or maybe minors, even though they are not the one addressed or the ones operators addressed by advertising. Of course, this is nothing has said. No one has said that, but minors are perpetually exposed to these practices, and so we are at the risk that they end up banalizing the implications of the activity, the potential risks of the activity. So this is one set of problems. The second set of problems is when the practice is directed towards maintaining, let's say, high rollers, VIP customers who are already enrolled in the operator, and so the operator wants to keep them up to pace. This, I would argue that even though less prominent, are the ones who are more related to direct harms being generated. And I'd say both of them requires different solutions and compatible solutions, but let me just say that we are increasingly, as a regulator, concerned over time with this second pattern of advertising, as if we didn't have enough with the first one, which is the one which creates more of a social fuss. But the second is starting to be, and quite legitimately so, a source of concern increasingly, at least in my own jurisdiction.
Let me ask next a question to Paul and Mark. So online gambling advertisement has been with us for 10 years or so. We have regulation covering it in several countries. And yet the issue seems to have really exploded right now in terms of media attention. Why do you guys think that there is such a laser focus on the advertising issue right now? Is it just that legislators have started to wake up to the risks, or is there something else going on that puts online gambling advertising in so much focus right now?
Yeah. I think there's a number of things. I mean, in Britain, we've had a lot of coverage about supposedly the rise of problem gambling amongst adults, adolescents, etc., and people are looking for reasons about why those rises might be there. I'm actually more sceptical whether there has been a rise, particularly amongst adults, but we have seen a big rise in things like sports betting, which do have things like advertising attached with them. I think there's also the other issues that are around, and it's not just about advertising, it's about marketing. I said right at the start, it's actually very hard to try and create things where you're not advertising to problem gamblers. It's much easier to set up regulations that protect children, but problem gamblers is hard. But there are things you can do. So, I mean, one of the things that I would be advocating is that any company, for instance, if you self-exclude, either temporarily or over a period of time, you should not send any advertising or marketing at all to those people. They've excluded for a reason. Now, we know that some people exclude because they're just annoyed with the company, but I'd rather be safe than sorry. You have a kind of regulation there. People also ask me about bonuses, okay? Because bonuses are often used as a way to acquire new customers. Now, believe it or not, even though I've spent 31 years studying problem gambling, I'm not anti-bonuses per se. What I am anti is what I call proportional bonuses, that you get more and more bonuses the more and more you spend with that particular company. Because obviously, it's not that everyone who's a really heavy spender is a problem gambler, but they're more likely to be in that particular group. What I'm equally, so let's take Sweden, for instance. Sweden have just opened up or just about to open up their regulation, and it won't be just Svenska Spel now. There'll be lots of other people on the market who can legally have operating licenses there. I've said to Svenska Spel, I mean, they're saying we're not going to have bonuses to get people to come onto our site because we think they're kind of socially responsible. But the thing is, what I would be saying is that if you want people to come onto a site like Svenska Spel, which is more socially responsible than some other places, you've got to be competitive, and bonuses are the way to do that. So if a bonus is offered, irrespective of what you spend, if you're just in a regular gambler that's going to spend 20 kroner every week on a lottery ticket, you shouldn't, they shouldn't be given any different from somebody that might be one of your VIP or heavy spenders. Going back to your original question, why has it come to the fore now? Well, I just think gambling is one of those things that's just come to the fore anyway. And, from my perspective, advertising is just one part of a very, very big jigsaw. There are kind of three kind of things that determine the acquisition, development, and maintenance of problem gambling. One is the kind of individual factors, your biological or genetic predisposition, your personality factors, the environment you're in. But there are also what we call situational factors, of which advertising and marketing, where you place your product. So you were saying before about you wouldn't want, to put gambling premises right next to a school. For instance, I mean, to me, that would be totally exploiting a particular situation. Then we've got the structural characteristics of the activity itself. We know that a bi-weekly national lottery has much less problems associated with it compared to a slot machine or a fixed odds betting terminal. And people say, well, so what you're saying, Mark, is that lotteries are non-problematic and slot machines are problematic. I'm saying no, because I could create you the safest slot machine in the world, and how I would do that is that when you come to play my slot machine, you can only press the button once on a Wednesday night and once on a Saturday night, and no one will ever become addicted to that slot machine. I could also create you the single most addictive lottery. Instead of having the draw on a Wednesday night and a Saturday night, I'll have the draw every minute. So it's not about the game. So what I'm saying to you is that advertising is a situational characteristic, and there are literally over 100 different factors that might determine why somebody becomes a problem gambler. But advertising has been seen as something that's a kind of easy target. There's lots of other things that we investigate that don't come into the papers, but advertising, because research has shown again and again and again, is that the general public are very, very aware of gambling advertising. That seems to be picked on, even though there's lots of other things that could be contributing to the rise of problem gambling.
I guess also because everyone sees advertising, only gamblers see the gamblers.
So gamblers see very specific things, but the vast majority of people are not what I would call regular gamblers.
Yeah.
Paul may have a different view, but...
Paul, what's your thoughts?
For me, I think it's three things. I think this tone and amount of adverts have changed. So you say it's been around for 10 years, but I think now there's a lot more adverts on TV, there's a lot more normalisation with sport. And I think the tone of them has changed. That's my big thing from today. I think now it's more, gambling's very sexy. It's fast paced. It's something where you're going to make money. It's how you make your dream. And I think that's dangerous. And I don't think, personally, going back to your last question, that operators are targeting kids or targeting vulnerable people. But they've got to also be aware that those populations do view these adverts, whether they're targeting them or not. And the message is important. We know there's a small percentage of people who become problem gamblers. I was one of those. But we also know there's a much larger percentage who are at risk of becoming problem gamblers. And it's that audience, I think, the at-risk group, who are potentially more affected by advertising. It might just be the thing that tips them over the edge and takes them into that problem gambling route. So I think it's tone, I think it's amount. I think also there is a focus, particularly in the UK, that the regulators really sharpening the teeth at the moment with sanctions, licence reviews, and things. I know a lot of that's around AML, I know a lot of that's around fraud, around verification and stuff like that as well. But what it's done, it's brought it into the press, and the press is quite powerful. So if the press has got sort of can be like a dog with a bone with something, and at the moment the gambling industry isn't popular within the press. So what they're doing is they're looking at the gambling industry per se, every aspect of it, and advertising is one part of it. So I think that's another reason why suddenly there's been an explosion of interest, the powerful press. And again, I'm probably basing it mainly on the UK, where we're from, but I certainly think that's part of it.
Let me see if there's any questions from the audience. Does anyone have a question for our panelists? No, okay, I have a question for Claire then. When we're talking about advertising, what do you see as the most problematic part of it? Is it the volume of the advertising, or is it the content? Are problem gamblers or children more likely to be susceptible to advertising if they're seeing it constantly, or if it's particularly targeted to them?
Okay. Just, if I may just react to on the sensitivity of the public opinions at the moment, actually, and afterwards I will answer your question, of course. Well, it's because it's also linked with volume, because the volume on gambling advertising can trigger the sensitivity of the public opinion, and especially when there is a massive presence on only one medium, like TV, for example. And the volume is linked to the scope of the legal offer, to the number of licensed operators, but also to the financial health of the national market. But there are two things that haven't changed. The fact that gambling is a particular economic activity with a risk of addiction, so it's a specific activity, and the fact that gambling has a cultural dimension. And in the current, social, political context globally, probably, we're in a time when people are more and more moved by what constitute their own culture and reluctant to what is not. So both the very nature of gambling and the cultural dimension of gambling, have always been there. It's just probably a lack of anticipation of the global social political context that leads us to what we can see in different countries at the moment. I mean, in France, for example, online we have only 3 online regulated sectors. So the market is small. We have less than 20 operators. So I mean, the communications, the commercial communications, are not that important. The volume of the media market of advertising in France has decreased actually in France. Well, it's the same as in 2012. In 2017, it has been the same amount as in 2012, although in percentage of the GGR, although the GGR as a reason. So probably what can also explain is it's probably also a lack of anticipation, and that's where what was said earlier, most certainly a higher sense of social responsibility can be part of the answer now. Now, if we talk about the volume or the content, actually it's both, because the volume has to be considered according to the content, in other words, to the target. As already mentioned, according to French law, we regulate commercial communication, so the scope is wide, and the challenge would be namely on social networks to differentiate informational content from commercial communications. If I may just follow up on bonuses. to give you an idea of, actually the media marketing budget in 2017 in France is 157 million euros, 66% of which, so 2/3 of which, is are expenses of the operators carried out of media. And within that, you get 50% on bonuses. But a distinction, as mentioned earlier, has to be made between retention bonuses and acquisition bonuses. And as I said, we have in France a regulatory framework, but this can always be adapted because, yes, when retention bonuses are allocated on the basis of ranking, which are established according to the spending of players within game, it's not possible to assert that gambling advertising may ever create a safer environment for consumers.
Juan, you had a thought?
Yes, as I was listening to your question, I was thinking that a really interesting issue would be when it comes to content over volume, to really think about what to target first regulatorily. Because of course it's about both things, but humbly, the way we've seen it in our jurisdiction so far at least is that it's much better off or much more attainable targeting content than volume. If you target volume, and to the extreme, this would mean banning advertising, say, below the watershed period in broadcast advertising or whatever, banning promotions. What is going to happen, and do nothing else, what is going to happen is that the marketing policies are going to, let's say, adapt. And so you will have, of course, less prominent advertising in broadcasting sports events, because you have banned them now, but you would have same budgets and from the operators, and you will have plenty of tipsters, YouTubers, prescribers, fora, and the like, which, of course, may be less prominent now, but might not be in 10 years or 5 years' time. Where if you tackle content, and I will place a very specific example, you can sort of not interfere over where the advertising is allocated, other than minor content, of course. But you can aspire to control how the communication is going to be dealt with. One example, you can say absolutely ban communications, betting communications in live broadcasting sports events, or you can say, I don't want, in these communications, I don't want promotions, I don't want in-play betting advertising, I don't want cash-out advertising, I don't want, let's say, impelling the consumer to to gamble, gamble now, gamble is so much fun, you're so cool by gambling. If you control all of these things, in the end what you're going to have, allegedly, is a less prominent, less volume, a less prominent advertising space, because operators are going to find increasingly so that it's might be not as profitable to them to maintain the same level of volume advertising if they cannot send these messages. So overall, it all amounts to a less volume. But you can control this. You can control the volume where you place the advertising and where you don't place the advertising. You can control in specific spaces, such as minor-related spaces. But by and large, the offer will adapt, and they will make their point somewhere else. So I would say, if I were forced to choose, I would say that it would be much more efficient regulating content over volume, and this is why I wanted to make the point.
I want to close with a very quick question to Apostolos to react to one thing that Claire said, which was questioning, is a sports figure an adult character or a minor's character? In your view, is a sports figure targeted toward children?
A sports figure, that's a trick question, thanks for that, the closing one. A sports figure definitely has an appeal, same way that any other prominent figure out there has an appeal. What is important is what the colleague from the Spanish regulatory body mentioned, that what is important is, for me, is not, of course, you will not have Mickey Mouse promoting Betson. That probably is totally unethical. But what is important is the message around that, what is being promoted and how it is being promoted. And I was thinking while this discussion was taking place that the more the regulator understands gaming and the more the gaming self-regulates itself, the better the results will be. It's the same situation that happened a decade ago or a little bit more with the banking. The adverts, at least in my country, were very similar to get a loan and get a new credit card and enjoy your holidays. Now you do not see, even in Greece, this type of holidays as much. There are other reasons, of course, but you do not see them. So the industry regulated, self-regulated the advertising, and now there is this concept, but it's different. The messaging is different. There is no chasing that dream by going in debt, for example, in the banking section. So that's my answer.
Great. Well, with that, we will close the panel. I want to thank our panelists very much for a very interesting discussion. Put a round of applause for them. And thank you all for being such a lovely, attentive audience for Responsible Gaming Day. That'll be it for us. I wish you a lovely afternoon. Thanks for joining us.